Good afternoon, my name is Isabelle and I'm going to present you with a paper entitled Why a Chair? Artistic Gestures as Acts of Memory and Reconstruction. And I'm just going to share my screen so that you can see the slides that I prepared for today. This paper examines the chair as an artistic gesture, as a way of addressing political violence and commemorating its victims. Chairs have the potential as symbolic objects to define relationships within society, if we think about kings, presidents, CEOs, etc. The seat becomes a symbol of authority and power. The artistic interventions I will describe in this paper use the chair as substitutes for the raw and violent images of the traumatic events they commemorate or embody. The chairs become intrinsic to memory. They provide a place where memory can be reenacted. They cross boundaries, although their primary function is not to bear the burden of these traumatic events. As Jenny Cass writes in her cultural study of a chair, and I quote, "Chairs have a unique potential among all of the available pieces of furniture to become more than the wood and glue of which they are comprised. The chair carries cultural baggage. The throne is royalty. The electric chair is crime and depravity. It has something to say both for the individual arriving in its restraints as for the society that demands its use." End of quote. There are, of course, other commemorations using chairs, such as the 2,753 chairs installed in September 2011 on the lawn at New York City's Bryant Park to mark the 10th anniversary of the World Trade Center disaster. I can also give you the example of 168 chairs permanently installed to remember victims of the 1995 bombing of the A.P. Murray Federal Building in Oklahoma City. This paper examines how chairs, as part of artistic interventions, act as a metaphor of absence and memory. The chairs mediate, commemorate disruptive events of strife and violence as experienced by the population of a neighborhood, a city, or a country at large. This proposed overview departs from Daniel Berset's broken chair, which still stands on the Place des Nations in Geneva 23 years after being placed there to encourage the signature of the Ottawa Convention in December 1997. I will then move to the work of Colombian artist Doris Salcedo with chairs and pieces of furniture, bearing witness to the Colombian Civil War and the silent disappearance of citizens during decades, before reflecting on Haris Pazovic's Sarajevo Red Line, an artistic act of commemoration in Sarajevo, marking the 20th anniversary of the start of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Finally, I will examine Nada Sehnaoui's installation back in 2008, Haven't 15 Years of Hiding in the Toilets Been Enough, in Marty Square, Beirut's historical city center. Violence is universal, omnipresent throughout our nations. The installations I will present you act as a kind of counter-memorials in face of a lack of closure by official discourses. The audience takes part in the act of remembering, taken as the new witnesses to the violence referred by the artworks and the way it inscribes itself in the space of a square or a street. There is no need to relate to the aesthetics of anthropomorphism to connect to these human traces, to a human suffering turned at the level of the individual victim. These often ephemeral monuments pay tribute to human beings who have been silenced and in which the space holds their memory. In each of these more artistic practices, the chair embodies an absence of a body, of victims, the fragility of a human body, and the invisibility of victims of war and violence. Yet the chair commemorates the social and human connection through the act of remembering collectively. As Edward Casey wrote in his Remembering, a phenomenological study, commemorating, and I'm quoting, commemorating also creates new forms of sociality, new modes of interconnection between past and present, self and other, one group and another, one form of thinking or acting or speaking and another, one sex and another, one art form and another. Commemorating does more than paying tribute to honorable actions undertaken in the past and at another place. It constructs the space and continues the time in which the commendably interhuman will be perduringly appreciated." End of quote. These artistic practices are very close to humanitarian efforts to give visibility to silence victims, and this makes me think of Judith Butler's reflection on when is a life grievable, a question she elaborates upon in her book Frames of War. Humanitarians and NGOs act in the names of the victims, in defense of them, and their work is made of endless negotiation with all parties involved in a conflict and the non-respect of human rights. Their greatest achievements are the signature of a peace agreement or a convention to respect human rights. And I'm just going to move now to Broken Chair by Daniel Berset. When it was installed in August 1997 on the Place des Nations in Geneva, Daniel Berset, the broken chair, was meant to stay in place for 3 months. Geneva, and especially the Place des Nations, embody several meanings on an international, humanitarian, and universal level. It is a gathering place for causes linked to the UN and the defense of human rights, as well as a crossing point for public transportation. The chair stands on 3 feet, the fourth one significantly broken, alluding to the way anti-personal minds can maim people, but do not kill them, leaving with atrocious scars for life. The chair is of a universal symbolism. Even maimed, it is still able to stand on its remaining feet. Made of 5.5 tons of wood with a height of 12 meters, this chair embodies international and universal values. Daniel Berset conceived the piece after discussing it with Paul Vermeulen, the founder and director of Handicap International Switzerland. The artist had been working with chairs since 1977-1983, and these were representative of his work well before the installation of the broken chair on the Place des Nations. Daniel Berset gives his interpretation of a chair. The chair is an act of civilization, a way of speaking about human beings without disclosing them. It is not only an object of comfort and conviviality, but also of power. When I did collaborate with Handicap International, it seems essential to us not to illustrate violence, but to suggest it. Implied violence allows it to deepen further reflection. I would never have thought that this sculpture would disturb so much. End of quote. This strong image was an open call to all nations to definitely forbid the use of anti-personal minds by signing the Ottawa Convention. As Handicap International didn't communicate when the chair was placed in August 1997, and I quote, "The chair has to communicate through the symbol rather than through the raw and shocking image of a victim who has just been maimed by a mine, allows everyone to develop a personal reflection without rejecting the message." End of quote. It has remained in place until today, although in 2006, during the redevelopment of the Place des Nations, it was removed, leading to a prolonged debate on whether to keep it or not. The UN were reluctant to leave it there because it was considered that the symbol was too hard and disturbing. The city of Geneva was eventually able to impose it and have it resettled on the same place on the 26th of February 2007. Beyond the commemoration of victims of landmines in Angola and in several countries around the globe, it stands alone for mankind, for the suffering of others, and the perpetual fight for survival. In 2000, Daniel Berset had another installation with red chairs, Ligne Rouge, taking place on the Quai Wilson during a UN conference on the interdiction of anti-personal minds in Geneva. For the duration of the conference, which was 5 days and 4 nights, one broken chair painted in red would be placed on the quay every 20 minutes. Until this day, 42 countries have not signed the Ottawa Convention, among them 3 permanent members of the UN Security Council, China, the United States of America, and Russia. This installation is a much more permanent installation than the other artistic installations I will present now. And The second example I wanted to show you today is by Doris Salcedo. Doris Salcedo is a Colombian artist based in Bogota. Her work often involves political violence in Colombia into abstract artworks that bear witness to loss and suffering. The state of emergency in Colombia has not raised much official national attention, whereas people kept disappearing without a trace for many decades. The state of loss and violence has afflicted the country since the late 1940s through abductions and executions. As Doris Salcedo states, and I quote, "In all of my work, I have addressed only one issue, political violence, because I strongly believe that violence defines the ethos of our society. I have focused on political violence not simply because I am Colombian, which in a way gives me a deeper and close knowledge of its effects, but because it is more than 60 years in constant war." End of quote. Hence, Salcedo constitutes a fragile memory of the missing. The chairs she uses mark the absence of a human body, its fragility, an absent and silent presence. Salcedo, who has worked mainly with domestic ready-made furniture, such as beds, armoires, and chairs since 1984, produced a series of installations that, according to Claudette Lawson, and I quote, capture both the mutilating, dehumanizing nature of political violence and the domestic, deeply intimate consequences of civil strife. End of quote. Salcedo took part to the 8th International Istanbul Biennale in 2003 with a powerful, meaningful installation in the neighborhood of Karaköy. It consisted of 1,550 wooden kitchen chairs piled between two buildings at Yemenichilo Kadesi 66. The pile of chairs reached the third floor of the building and seemed rather unstable, ready to collapse at any time. Salcedo had previously used the motif of a chair for two installations. Tenebre, November 6, 1985, at the Camden Art Centre in London in 2002, and November 67 at the Palace of Justice in Bogota, also in 2002. Here you just have a detail of her installation at the Istanbul Biennale, when you can see actually the way the chairs were piled up on one another. November 6 and 7 refers to the 1985 storming of a Colombian high court by M19 guerrillas. The siege and battle, which killed over 100 people, left 70 people missing, and the building in flames. I will describe it as a two-day performance taking place in Bogota, on the facade of the Palace of Justice, the exact same place where the events unfolded in 1985. It commemorates the 54 hours of the siege and battle. This particular event is highly contested in Colombian history until today. Although most historical accounts concur that over 100 people died during the military assault on the palace, Salcedo relies on a source quoting 280 victims for her installation, offering her own interpretation of these events. And you will see that there will be 280 chairs hanging from the roof on the facade of the Palace of Justice. Salcedo commemoration, a little bit like Daniel Berset red line, try to measure the duration and the scale of a siege by a slow lowering of the chairs, sliding them down the facade of the Palace of Justice. The wooden chairs were slowly suspended against the facade of a newly reconstructed building from different points on the roofs. At the end of the performance, the 280 chairs were transforming the unity of a facade into a cacophony of empty chairs. And I can show you the way it unfolded during the 2 days here. With his highly specific performance, Salcedo tried to reconcile, through an ephemeral work of art, the raw facts. She did not differentiate the casualties between victims and perpetrators, guerrillas, soldiers, and hostages. All got the same attention from the artist as victims of this tragic event in a shared gesture of commemoration. Of course, the chairs here resonate with the absent bodies of the victims, and Salcedo articulates her choice of the chairs as follows, and I quote, "The empty chairs are statements of absence, allowing one to be aware of the fragility of those who were behind those walls 17 years ago. Exposed and suspended on the stone facade, the empty chair emphasizing the vulnerability not only of those who worked in the Palace of Justice, but of us all. This piece is vulnerable from within and unprotected on the exterior." End of quote. In such spaces of mournful commemoration, as in Salcedo's work, chairs occupy a purpose of rendering the absent body a palpable present, a metonym for their disappearance. And I'm moving now to my third example today, which is Sarajevo Red Line. And Sarajevo Red Line was a commemoration for the 11,541 victims of a siege in Sarajevo, which took place on the 6th of April 2012, marking the 20th anniversary of the beginning of the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Known as the longest siege in modern history, the siege of Sarajevo lasted for 1,425 days. Sarajevo Red Line was designed by film and theatre director Haris Pašović to pay homage to the victims in a powerful yet simple way. Pašović placed these red plastic chairs around in 825 rows on Titova Street, the main street of the city center. Most poignant were the 643 little chairs suggesting the children who fell victims of the siege. Screens were displayed along the installation, scrolling the names of the victims by alphabetical order, 1 second for each name, the whole list lasting for up to 3 hours, and a stage was closing the entire installation. Artists from the Sarajevo Opera performed for 1 hour on stage, a concert for those who could not attend, as Pašović explains. The installation of chairs formed an auditorium, but deprived its audience. The viewers could not come because they were dead. There was this present absence or absent presence. End of quote. In a city where every inhabitant lost a relative, a friend, or a neighbor, passers-by connected to this commemoration and interacted by choosing a chair for their loved ones, bringing flowers in their way to pay tribute to them. Children brought toys and teddy bears. Their parents could explain the siege to them through this abstract visualization rather than through its images of violence. The initial shock and grief turned into some kind of grace and love. Sarajevo Red Line was meant to be an ephemeral, temporary way of setting up a memorial in the public space. The city got together in a very unusual way to commemorate the dead, because there was no space for the living in this installation. As a theatre director, Pašović is used to work in an empty theatre, with the actors on stage during rehearsals. The idea of a chair came from the meaning of his empty seats, which will one day be occupied and the theatre full of life during official representations. In 1997, at the end of the war, during the first pop concert which took place in the city center, Pašović realized how much lives and how many lives 10,000 people represent. And he also realized the absence of a victim of a siege and the meaning of his absence to the daily life of a city. Psychologist Julia Bala and her colleagues called the power of artistic commemoration while investigating Sarajevo Red Line and its effects on a fractured society. Sarajevo Red Line and this effect to connect together people on an international level, even people who were not even Bosnians or familiar with the siege of Sarajevo. The press coverage and an unprecedented and unexpected effect, with media from virtually everywhere reporting on this overwhelming event. Sarajevo Red Line is about how to represent memory in an ever-shifting society. Pašović himself does not consider his authorship important. His own role is so small compared to the scale of the commemoration. He's very humble about it, saying the commemoration is much bigger than an individual artistic gesture. This is an example of an individual action which contributes to collective memory and public commemoration. The last example I chose to present today took place in Beirut, the capital city in Lebanon, in 2008. This time, it is not a commemoration to the dead, but to the livings and their coping mechanism during the war. We are all aware of the everlasting state of violence and conflict which has prevailed in the country since the 1970s, and the recent events which unfolded since October 2019. Lebanese artist Nada Sehnaoui had the idea not to install chairs, but toilet seats on Martyrs Square, a meaningful and strategic location for all inhabitants, a no man's land during the war where only militia could enter. Entitled, "Haven't 15 years of hiding in the toilets been enough?" The installation was put in place for 2 weeks, and the Beiruti could interact with them by coming to Martyrs Square, sitting down and listening to readings or performances during this time. The toilet seats were used as chairs, but despite their awkwardness, these seats had a real signification, embodying fears and threats that the inhabitants of Beirut had to endure during the war. Like staircases or basements, toilets and bathrooms were a place to which one could seek refuge and hide during the shelling on the city. These rooms are often devoid of windows, but it was also the place when one could give way to his or her emotional state, to these feelings of solitude and discouragement. In the face of the Lebanese conflict, individuals had no impact on the unfolding of events and their duration, and they just had to endure them and hope for the best, as they used to say. So now we did write a text on sitting down back in 2001, reflecting on a population in the waiting, in desperate need for a change and for resuming a normal life one day. And you have this text here. When I was 15, I sat down. It was not to study because there was no electricity. It was not to flirt. The school was closed. It was to wait. Hours, days, weeks. I was not allowed to sit down. In the corridors, the bathrooms, basements, elevator cases, we sat by thousands. Hours, days, weeks. This installation for the Lebanese youth, for those who are no longer here, so that memory can transmit itself. This text was written by Sehnaoui the same year she did another installation, Promenade in Your Dream, with 50 chairs at the International College in Beirut. It was a participative installation during which students could write or draw a reply to one basically simple but also difficult question, which was, what would be the school of your dreams? Chairs and text were placed in an open-air amphitheater, replacing a human audience, this time again. And I'm just coming to an end with a conclusion. The 4 artistic practices I have presented today share some elements, although they all emerge in a very specific, often local context. Their suggestion of absence, of the void, are a direct allusion to the human presence and to mankind. Such absent corporeal themes allow the audience to connect to their own personal experience of loss. These artistic gestures challenge the usual temporary and physical frameworks which characterize public commemoration. There is a sense of universality in these installations, all departed from individual, private initiatives in a will to escape official modes of memorialization through the impermanence of time and space. Berset, Salcedo, Pašović and Sehnaoui created a fragile, temporary framework that the audience needed to acknowledge in some way. They suggested a narrative of a reconstruction of violent events rather than imposing the official narrative of history. Their art shows how architecture of a city, of a square, or of a building can become the container of state violence and can be later turned into a site of conciliation and commemoration. This paper was not only on power, vulnerability, hope, and despair. It is about mankind's place in the world and the humanitarian intervention, without which, more often than not, commemoration cannot take place, because these traumatic events are not acknowledged as such by official local state discourse. As Maurice Halbwachs wrote in his collective memory, and I quote, "Memory constructs an image of the past in accord with the predominant thoughts of a society," end of quote. These artists try to suggest the reconstruction of an image according to a society, a population's remembers, and not from the state official notion of remembering. You would have noticed that some of the chairs I did speak about today were painted or produced in red. Red, the color of blood. Red, also the color of life. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.